I think for me, it's been going back to a bit of what's controllable and what's not controllable. And so the fact that in the future I could need surgery outside of my control, the fact that things could get worse in the future, partially in my control. And so that fear, I think I've channeled into a more positive way of living my life in terms of really holding myself accountable to sleep, stress, diet, making sure I take my meds, making sure I'm going to all my doctor's appointments, getting my labs done, etc.
On today's episode of Colitis Unfiltered, I am thrilled to talk to Kyle, who got diagnosed with Crohn's disease at age 9 in Atlanta, Georgia. So Kyle, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Frank. Really excited to talk.
So let's go way back to the beginning of your IBD journey, age 9. So I'm assuming you still have at least some memories of how this all happened. And my first question I'd like to ask is really how it all came to be. And that means sort of first symptoms, or like the moment where either you or your parents or all of you realized that something was wrong. Can you take me a little bit through how this IBD started to manifest with you specifically?
Yeah, it's actually funny. About, I think, 3 months before I started exhibiting symptoms, I remember I was walking maybe like in a park with my dad, and I think I just learned about tapeworms. And so we were talking about like what the experience of a tapeworm would feel like. And I remember at the time I was just, as a typical kid, eating a ton of food and just always so hungry. And so 3 months later, and granted, this was almost 2 decades ago, so I think a lot of the details have slipped, but the symptoms started hitting. And I remember for me specifically, I was throwing up. I was having really, really intense stomach pain. And then the very typical Crohn's symptoms of diarrhea, going to the bathroom a ton. There was probably blood in my stools as well, feeling very tired. And I remember my mom taking me to the pediatrician, and they were testing me for stomach flu and thought maybe it's just some type of stomach bug. I think as a kid, there's a bit of, I just feel really sick and we're trying to figure out what it is. And I'm shuttling in and out of so many different doctors, and they're not really telling me. They're more talking to my parents than talking to me on like what's happening, what they're testing for, etc. And so as a kid, I just remember I'd go into the doctor, I'd get pricked in the arm, and they'd take blood, or they want to do certain tests, or eventually, after multiple months of all these different tests, they want me to go have a colonoscopy. And my parents, I think they made it a bit easier on me. They gave me like incentives to like look forward to some of these things. And so when I started Remicade a few years later, we had like this contract where like I would eat like X amount of fruits per week, and like every single time I got Remicade, we would go get Chick-fil-A like right before we got Remicade, and that was my treat. And so it made it so that like I looked forward to some of these milestones. And so like I remember when I was going into the doctor, you know, when I was first getting diagnosed, I think like one of the treats was, it was like a Game Boy or something like that. And so I remember a lot of the time when the doctor was talking, I think I would just, like, not even really paying attention to what he was telling my parents.
So you just said you might not have been paying much attention, but in terms of diagnosis, like was it the doctor that tried to talk to you directly and explain to you a little bit about what you had, or was it your parents who explained any aspects of Crohn's disease to you? How did you become familiar with what you actually were suffering from?
Definitely partially, probably a big part my fault, but also maybe a bit of a failure on the healthcare system. Is that no one ever really explained to me what Crohn's was, what caused it, why it manifests. And it wasn't until I got to college, like over a decade later, that doctors started throwing around jargon, and I started doing a tiny bit more research, looking online. When I was first diagnosed, my doctor at the time said, you have Crohn's disease. That's why you're going to the bathroom so often. That's why you're having this really, really intense pain. We're going to put you on meds for it. In addition to the meds, you can't eat popcorn, nuts, seeds, beans, like those 4 foods, or like you'll have to get your intestines taken out. And so I spent the next decade plus of my life not really knowing what Crohn's is, and then just being like, okay, if I have these specific foods, they're somehow just gonna get stuck in my intestines or rupture something, and then I'm gonna have to have a major surgery and have like a colostomy bag for the rest of my life. It was a very, very long journey, I think, and it ended up being more self-directed until I found a clinician who could help.
Yeah. That's pretty intense for somebody to say, "Hey, if you eat popcorn or beans, you're gonna have your intestines taken out." I mean, that's I'm not sure that's sort of the norm or the typical protocol, but it's definitely the first I hear of a doctor saying that to somebody, especially a kid, and it's, so okay. So long journey, age 9. It's a crucial age because you're not even in your teens yet, and they are coming, and you are entering that period of your life with a condition that nobody really explained to you exactly, but you know obviously what your symptoms are. Before we kind of move to the treatments, how did you start navigating life as a young boy still with this newly diagnosed inflammatory bowel disease?
I think I kind of, in a lot of ways, denied the existence of it. And I know we're going to get into treatment later, but I've never been in remission. I've always had active disease. I've always had active symptoms. And so I've just gotten, I through that period of my life, had gotten really good at hiding those symptoms in an outward way. And so I think a lot of it was feeling embarrassed. I mean, when your main symptoms are the one that's maybe most frustrating at times is having to go to the bathroom a lot and having diarrhea and having stomach pain. It's embarrassing things to talk about, especially as a kid. And I think a big piece of me felt ashamed of having those symptoms. And so I didn't want to be defined by them. I would try to make it as unassuming, non-apparent as possible. And on top of that, and this also, I mean, this extended on until after college for me. And I think I did a lot of things in spite of having Crohn's and really tried to push myself beyond what my doctors told me I could or couldn't do.
Maybe sort of unconsciously you try to compensate for something by trying to push your body, especially again dealing with something that is or can be so violent as someone of a young age that doesn't really understand how it works. So navigating this disease as a teenager, were you ever angry at other people, jealous of other people, envious of other kids, friends, people that you went to school with around you because they seem to be living a quote unquote normal life compared to yours?
I think the hatred was more directed inwards. I really hated this feeling that my body was failing me. It felt like no matter what I did, even if I listened to my doctor and took all my meds, I would still feel really, really sick. And I think this anger also fueled me in some ways where the symptoms were always there no matter what. And it would fluctuate a tiny bit. It would get a little worse, it would get a little better. And so I felt it didn't really matter what I did lifestyle wise or like taking time to rest, or there'd be like other things doctors would tell me, like take take it easier, like you don't need to be like trying to do everything all at once. And my view was I'm going to have this for the rest of my life if I continue to listen to doctors and I continue to listen to like what my parents are telling me, then I'm just not going to do anything in life. I'm just going to stay home. I'm going to feel really crappy all the time. And that's not the life that I wanted. And so it was this mixture of not wanting to feel constrained by the disease and a really strong deep-seated anger and a feeling that my body was failing me, but not directed really towards other people.
We'll get back to this sort of, you know, feeling that your body betrayed you and anger towards your body. But before we get to, you mentioned, you've never really achieved remission. So talk us a little bit through the different treatments, medications that you were on. And I'm also curious to see how this progressed over the years, because obviously you're no longer 9 years old. There's a whole bunch of years in between, and yet you say you've never really achieved remission. How did Crohn's evolve from diagnosis to today, essentially?
Yeah, yeah. So my inflammation, I think, was probably more severe at certain points in my patient journey. When I say I've never been in remission, I mean I've always had active inflammation and I've always had symptoms, but I haven't always been in a flare. When I was first diagnosed, I don't remember. I know that there's step therapy, so you fail out of all these different meds. The first med that I landed on that worked for a sustained period of time was Remicade. And as a kid, that meant I would go into an infusion clinic. Initially, it was every 2 months. Very quickly, that wasn't working, so I went down to 1 month. So every month, I'd go in and get a 3-hour IV. On top of this, in college, maybe, or maybe towards the end of high school, they added methotrexate on top of that. And so then there was a ton of other pills that were put on top of that to deal with the side effects. And then some of those other pills had other side effects. And so on the Remicade, I still had active symptoms. I was still having extreme abdominal pain. I would still have diarrhea, blood in my stools, fatigue, but the inflammation wasn't increasing. And I think my doctor felt, with the medication available at the time and the risk of changing to a different medication, it was under control enough to reduce future surgery risk. When I was in college, I started developing antibodies to the Remicade. And so the medication was just no longer effective in general. This was also compounded by a C. diff infection that I got. And so as I was becoming immune to the Remicade, we started experimenting with different medicines. So I tried Entyvio, I tried Stelara. Neither of those worked. Then I got put on prednisone, which, it's an effective medication for sure. It's That's the worst experience I've ever had in my life with a medication. There are periods where I'm still having like really, really intense abdominal pain. And so my doctor prescribes me tramadol. And so I have to make a choice when I'm going to class of, do I want to take my tramadol and be high on pain meds, struggling to pay attention? Or do I want to be in a ton of pain, still struggling to pay attention? Eventually, we found the C. diff, and there was still active inflammation, but the prednisone tamped down the inflammation, getting rid of the C. diff, which was also a really arduous process with expensive medications. And eventually, I had to get a fecal transplant, which is also something that I found super embarrassing and super gross. After the prednisone, we were pretty much out of medications. That's the way that my doctor pitched it to me. And so they wanted to put me on a clinical trial for a new medication that would do something to my sperm where I couldn't have kids. And so I'm a sophomore in college being told that my last opportunity is to take part in some experimental drug that will then make me not able to have kids in the future. And they're not even sure it'll work. I think the last step before that was, let's try Humira, because I hadn't done that one yet. But the doctor, I don't think, was super confident that was going to work. So I start the Humira and see some positive indications. Once again, I not having my inflammation go down to zero. I still have some active inflammation. I still have symptoms. I still have, when I'm walking to class, I'm throwing up in the mornings. I'm still having diarrhea. And also, I'm in college doing a lot of things that are probably not healthy for my body. Like I remember one thing, which in retrospect seems so stupid, but when I would go to the gym, like I would force myself to stay active and to go to the gym, but I would do pre-workout every morning, which has so much caffeine in it, which is so bad for the GI. But there's like 6 months where I was just doing like pre-workout every morning, which is absolutely insane. But now I've been on Humira since around 2017, 2018. So 7, 8 years. I have been on the Humira methotrexate combo since then. And upon graduating college, entering the working world, still symptomatic. When I moved to Boston, new provider, she set me up with an IBD dietitian. And so I learned a lot more about diet and the impact of diet. And over the years, I'd heard so much conflicting advice on that. Um, at my university, I didn't really believe in diet. You go online to these Facebook groups or Reddit, and people promise all these miracle diets. My family had always been sending me these different miracle diets or telling me to try CBD or go try acupuncture or go try yoga or just other random, more holistic medicine alternative treatments, which some of them probably do help some people. They just hadn't worked for me. And I think I had written off diet as one of those woo-woo treatments that don't actually work. Living in Boston with this new provider, the dietitian, I think, gave me some of the initial building blocks. And over time, I still have active inflammation, but my symptoms have gone down a lot more. And this is the closest I've ever felt to remission at this point, where it's still Humira methotrexate and then being a lot cleaner in what I'm eating. And then the last update is methotrexate's not great. There's risks for that and methotrexate toxicity. And so 3 months ago, I started Tremfya, which is a newer drug. And the hope is to wean me off of the methotrexate and replace that with the Tremfya, which could potentially be safer for my body. So I'm only a few months in. I'm feeling better, but it could be a bit placebo. I think it'll take time to really see, and also probably need to do some more like fecal calprotectin and inflammation testing to see if it's actually impacting the underlying disease.
Yeah. So long journey to get closer to remission, but quite not quite there yet either. How do you keep hope alive when it feels like your own body is basically constantly working against you?
Going back to earlier in my journey where I really hated my body and fought against it, and then getting to a point where you just accept that's how your body functions and giving it more grace when you have flare-like episodes, you're having more symptoms at a period of time. And moving past even just accepting it to having compassion for your body, I think reframed my mindset. And so when my disease is more active, when I'm feeling more symptomatic, I definitely feel more melancholy and maybe a bit more frustrated with my body. But the periods where I'm not feeling so sick that I can't leave home, to me, my Crohn's diagnosis becomes something less central to who I am. Over the years, I think have pushed past a lot of the barriers or guardrails that other people have put on me or constructed around me. And I know, I think, what I'm capable of. I guess, like, to be more concrete on this, when I was in college, I remember my doctor telling me, you can't drink, you shouldn't be going to all these parties. I really wanted to study abroad. You can't study abroad. You really shouldn't be traveling at all. My first job out of college, I was working a job that was 60 to 80 hours a week. My next job out of college after that was 100 plus hours per week. So very intense. A lot of the time, still doctors saying you shouldn't be traveling. I love hiking. I love backpacking. Like going on a 7 day backpacking camping trip, not something you should be doing. And so I think I lumped all of this, you shouldn't be doing these things, into one, and just felt like I was being constrained by these clinicians and by other people. And it took a lot of time for me to start to parse out and to separate, like, yes, there are certain things I shouldn't be doing as much of. I should not be drinking heavily. I should really be conscientious that I'm getting 8 hours of sleep and that I'm getting adequate exercise per week. On the other hand, I can travel. I can go hike and camp. I'll have to take more precautions. I'll have to bring, certain types of food with me. I'll pack a lot of Imodium. I'll pack electrolytes, my Zofran, my wet wipes, all of that. And so I think it's a bit of realizing there are some things outside of my control that, like, if I drink alcohol, my body is going to react. but there's a lot of things in my control that I can learn to deal with. And so the hope is where the hope springs for me is I'm a lot stronger than I give myself credit for at times. And I think in general, I love my body and I trust my body to be able to do what it can do. And so I have hope through this confidence in myself where yes, there are the uncontrollables, but for the controllables, I can take care of those. And so I can make the best type of life that I can by focusing on those controllable factors.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a very positive approach, especially if you're still dealing with active disease. Now, how do you deal with fear in terms of the future, right? When it comes to your Crohn's, because you've burned through a lot of medications. Yes, you found a GI or medical team now that supports you much better than maybe the doctors before. But yeah, how do you deal with this thinking, which I'm sure you have, because, or at least you've thought of it, right? Like, hey, there's not many treatments left. I still haven't really fully achieved remission. What is going to happen to me, if my symptoms get worse? How do you navigate this sort of fear that most people with active IBD still have as they sort of, move along in their journey?
Yeah. I think for me, it's been going back to a bit of what's controllable and what's not controllable. And so the fact that in the future I could need surgery outside of my control, the fact that things could get worse in the future, partially in my control. And so that fear, I think I've channeled into a more positive way of living my life in terms of really holding myself accountable to sleep, stress, diet, making sure I take my meds, making sure I'm going to all my doctor's appointments, getting my labs done, etc., and staying on top of that. And there are periods where that fear spikes. And so when I'm having a conversation with my doctor and she's telling me, yeah, the inflammation has increased compared to your last appointment. If it keeps progressing, we'll have to explore a different medication. And if there's no other medications left, then like surgery and talking through that. I think they're more temporal fears based on the condition and how my disease is progressing. But I try not to make myself overly anxious or to focus on it too much when it's things that are outside of my control or things that may or may not happen.
Yeah, it's a good approach. I think it's a very good approach. So you've been through a very long Crohn's journey, and like you mentioned earlier, you started off really not knowing too much about the disease. You went through phases of embarrassment, maybe a little bit of isolation as well, but then you sort of got older, you got wiser, you learned to live with the disease in a different way. You sort of realized that Crohn's started to change you as a person as well. And after speaking to you before we started the episode here, we talked about advocacy. So I think you've also started coming out of your shell a little bit and started to share your own journey. But you've gone a little bit beyond just advocating or raising awareness, because you launched a project that's called trytummy.com. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I just sum it up, it's sort of an app providing some sort of IBD and IBS support. Talk to us a little bit about what this is, what it does, and then also what trigger you experience in you to say, hey, let's take my experience and do something positive with it.
I guess I'll start with what triggered me and then I can get into what we're doing at Tummy. So my first job out of college, I mentioned it was a corporate job. It was an intense workplace environment. You're working very late hours every single day. And this was also COVID. I graduated 2020, and so I started this job 2020. And so it was very isolating. And I remember uh, my team every night at 7 p.m. we would do like a checkout call where you would chat with the team and say like what you're going to work on for the rest of the night. And you'd also sometimes just chat. You would shoot the shit a little bit. And I remember one night we were all sharing different things about ourselves, and I mentioned some of my anxiety about how I was going to manage this really intense job and my health. Um, and so from this conversation, they told me that I should get involved with this disability support group that was at the company. And I think I had reached out and maybe didn't get a response, or it just wasn't very active. And so I decided to start a support group within my own office. And I was having all these conversations with people that also had chronic diseases, invisible disabilities, visible disabilities, and realizing how similar their experience was to mine. And I felt so much meaning and purpose in being able to relate and help these people. And so I, after that, moved to Boston for another job and started to feel a sense of ennui really settle in, where I wasn't doing anything meaningful. I didn't feel like I was making a positive impact in the world. And I still really wanted to do something to help the chronic disease population or folks, in similar situations to myself. And so I decided to go back to school in 2024 to pivot into entrepreneurship, to start something that would help chronic disease patients. And so I spent my first year exploring different ideas. And towards the second half of my first year, we had one class on operations where it was mapping out the process flow of a certain task, and figuring like where the pain points are in that. And so I was like, why don't I just map out the process flow of like what it's like to be a Crohn's patient? And so I mapped out from diagnosis to even pre-diagnosis to getting diagnosed to getting your treatment to like managing flares to continuing on. What are all the different steps that a typical patient goes through? And I identified one point that had been really, really painful in my life, which was around diet. And that was in figuring out which foods are triggering my symptoms and which diet actually works for me to feel better. And as I had more and more conversations with patients, I realized that this wasn't just a me problem. This was a problem that a lot of people were having. And it inspired us to start building Tummy. And so the idea behind Tummy is that we provide personalized, actionable insights for what foods and other lifestyle factors are triggering people's symptoms. The long-term vision is to create something holistic so that end to end, a patient can come on, they can write down what their diagnosis is, age, other demographic factors that might be relevant. And then over time, as we learn more about them and their specific condition, their specific reactions, we're able to provide clearer patterns and insights into what foods are specifically triggering them. And as a patient myself, I've tried so many different diets. I saw a dietitian and they give you this food journal where you're manually writing everything down, and then you're looking through it, trying to figure out, okay, was it because I had potatoes this one day, or was it because I had something fried, or is it some other ingredient that I'm not even realizing? And so really what we're trying to do is to simplify that process for the patient and to give them more control in their journey so that they don't have to worry, they don't have to spend as much time writing down, logging every single thing, and then figuring out the patterns. Instead, you could just take out your phone, take a picture of what you're eating, log when you have symptoms, and then let us on the back end use machine learning to figure out, like, specific to you, what is causing your symptoms and what can you change to feel better.
That's a great initiative, and this is at trytummy.com. So people should definitely check that out, especially for people. And I agree with you. I mean, you yourself sort of brought the aspect of nutrition into sort of your disease management, and it really seems to be going into that direction as well. So this is a really cool project. In the spirit of helping people, as we kind of get to the end here, especially as someone who spent many, many years sort of looking for remission without too much success, like we discussed, what would be your message to folks who are struggling with active Crohn's and who are potentially not really seeing an end in sight, right? People who are also going or jumping from one treatment to another without too much improvement, based on your own experience with the disease and how the disease has changed you.
I
What would
think
you tell those
number one
people?
is community. It is so important to have a support system around you because Crohn's, colitis, IBD in general can be so isolating, and it's very easy to self-isolate as well. And so making sure that you you might not have a ton of energy, you might not, be able to go out and see people all the time, but make some effort, I think, to sustain that community and also just be open. I was so worried about people seeing me as weaker or less capable or less able. But when I shared, hey, I'm feeling like really sick today, I'm having like these symptoms, people were very accommodating. Like people were not like, oh, you're weaker, you're less capable. People were like, oh, how can I help? What can I do? And so I think learning to be okay with relying on others, especially when you're in active disease, is so, so important. On top of that, there are some darker periods where it does feel hopeless. I think it's difficult to give like generalizations or platitudes of like you will find a solution or like you will find a cure, the thing that works for you, because it's so person to person. You might end up having to get surgery. But I think one thing that kept me going was knowing that even during the periods where my disease was super active and I would feel so, so bad every day, were the little moments of happiness or the little moments of beauty that I saw in the world, and really savoring those things. Even when I was, at the deepest, darkest depths of my depression, just seeing snow fall. I went to school in Tennessee. It never snows there, and seeing, just like a white blanket on the the ground outside with all the snow out there, or you have a friend who comes by and brings you food one day, even though you didn't ask, and you realize how kind and nice people are. I think just like really savoring those small, beautiful little moments in your life, to push through at least some of the darkness.
Is that what you would tell your own self as a 9-year-old if you could go back in time and talk to that 9-year-old kid?
Yeah, it's funny because I do a lot of advocacy work with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation as well. So I've spoken since a kid, spoken at a few events, and I do lunch and learns, and I've helped on a lot of different events. And last year I was the mission speaker for one of their fundraising events, and I had like an ending line of like, what did I wish 9-year-old me knew at the time? And I think the biggest thing is it's okay to not feel okay, and it's okay to be open about that. And I think the more that you don't try to carry the burden of pain on your own, the easier it becomes to share that pain with others and to sustain onwards.
Honestly, I think that is the perfect word and perfect phrasing to end it. I think you've said it all, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and also what you're doing. I hope for you that you'll find some peace, and that at least, even though you haven't reached remission yet, that you kind of stay where you are now with your combination of therapy and also nutrition, and keep advocating and keep doing that work, in the name of advocacy and IBD awareness. It's really great. So thanks so much, Kyle, and all the best to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Frank. And I really love what you're doing with this show and all the other work in the space. I feel like visibility is so important, and providing community and just hearing other people's stories is so transformative. And so thank you so much for doing this.
And we're going to both keep doing that. Great. Thank you, Kyle. That's it for today's episode of Colitis Unfiltered. I'm Frank Tabering, and if this hit home or hit your gut, do us a favor, subscribe to the show, and follow us at Colitis Unfiltered on YouTube, Substack, Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and Reddit. We'll see you soon for more inspiring stories from the bathroom floor.